Time. It's 1 p.m. in Stockholm, Sweden. Welcome again, all of you. If you just logged in, welcome for today's talks. And we are just about to hear a conversation between Professor James Ogude and PhD Isabel Perez. I am Otso Kortekangas, a postdoc working here at KTH. I will be a moderator of this discussion. So what I will do is just very shortly introduce Isabel and then let her take over and introduce Professor Ogude and lead the conversation. And you as attendees will not have a video on, will not have audio on. It's only us three here that will have those functions on, but you can introduce yourself in a chat function and have a discussion with each other in a chat function. If you want to pose a question to Professor Ogude or Isabel for that matter, use the Q&A function. And in the Q&A function, you can also vote questions, vote for questions or like questions that you find are most relevant, and that way they will be voted up and we can see which questions from the audience are the most relevant, democratically speaking, and we can pose those questions. Either I will take care of that, pose some of those questions either in the midst of the discussion or in the end, depending a little bit about how the structure and flow of this discussion will go. I think that's technicalities really, and now it's my pleasure to introduce Isabel Perez. Welcome. Isabel earned her PhD in 2017 from KTH, from the Environmental Humanities Lab. And currently she is a Juan de la Cierva postdoctoral fellow at the Department of English, French and German at the University of Oviedo in Spain. And her research focuses on literary representations of environmental injustices, mostly in Chicano communities and in the US US Southwestern literature in general. And you're of course also free to present yourself a little bit more if you feel like it. But Isabel, very happy to have you here, and we are all ears. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Otso, and thank you, Sabine, for your introductions. And welcome everybody to this conversation on this second day of the stream's teaser. Thank you for being here with us today, or for devoting some of your time to watching this sometime in the future, where this will be posted as well. My name is Isabel Perez, as Otso just said, and I am honored to have been invited to interview Professor James Ogude. Professor Ogude is a director at the Center for the Advancement of Scholarship at the University of Pretoria. This is so since 2017, although he has been with the center since May 2013. He is rated as an A2 researcher by the National Research Foundation, and he has just concluded a 5-year project on the Southern African philosophical concept of Ubuntu, a concept that we will be discussing today in our conversation, as you can guess from the title for this session, that is Ubuntu and the Principle of Co-Agency in African Ecology. This project has been funded by the Templeton World Charity Foundation. Professor Ogude is currently leading a Mellon-funded supranational project involving the universities of Ghana, Makerere, Cape Town, and Pretoria. He is also the director of the African Observatory for Environmental Humanities, which is located at the Center for the Advancement of Scholarship. He's the author of Ngugi's novels and African history, Narrating the Nation, and he has edited several books and one anthology of African stories. The most recent edited book is Ubuntu and the Reconstitution of Community, published by Indiana University Press in 2019. So welcome, James, and thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you, Isabel. And I also wish to thank the organizers of the streams. It's my pleasure to take part in this very important conversation, I believe. And I'm looking forward to engaging with all of you. Thank you.
So in order to start our conversation today, I would like to start talking about the pandemic, because given the worrisome current global situation of public health emergency, and that we will be talking precisely about Ubuntu, which, as we will see later, it's a notion that relates to ideas of community and communal well-being. Maybe we could, as I said, start by inquiring about this COVID-19 pandemic, which is something that was already discussed during yesterday's last session with Greta Gard. And in the context of our conversation, I would like to inquire about the specific impact of the pandemic in South Africa and South African society. So how is the pandemic affecting the country and the rest of the continent? How is it being dealt with in general terms?
Thank you again, Isabel. I think we are living in very difficult times. The pandemic has had a huge impact on, several sectors of our society, our health infrastructure, and the well-being of the majority of our people, especially the poorest of the poor within the continent. And this is in relation to the weak economic and social infrastructure that, as you may all know, is a problem within not just Southern Africa or South Africa, but across the whole continent. The problem is obviously worse in urban settlements, and it's worse in urban settlements precisely because of the spatial arrangements that we find within our urban cities. The majority of our people live within very close proximity to each other. What we call, for example, locations in South Africa, which is embedded within the apartheid, geographies and spatial structures, was built in ways that make it quite impossible, if I may say that, to exercise social distancing, for example. Similar problems are also experienced in squatter settlements. And squatter settlements is a typical feature of African urbanities, whether you're talking of, Johannesburg, or you're talking of Nairobi or Lagos, it's a huge problem. And because of that complicated spatial arrangement, it's been very difficult, to contain the pandemic. But that said, I think that generally our people have done extremely well. We are a very resilient communities, in spite of our stresses, in spite of our vulnerabilities, in spite of our fault lines, which this pandemic exposed. There's a sense in which people have also responded quite magnanimously to the challenge, and one has to commend them. But again, that said, there's a way in which the pandemic has exposed, as I said, certain fault lines that were embedded already in our economic systems, in our social structures. For example, it has exposed problems of dire poverty. Food security has been compounded. And as we talk now, a number of African countries are facing the problem of food security, again, amongst the most vulnerable people within our societies. And these are things that, obviously one never, anticipated. But in many ways, they are linked, as I said, to the nature of infrastructure, the weak infrastructures that we have in relation to some of these things. And linked to that too is development aid, that a number of African societies rely on, has been slow in coming. It's been slow in coming because, societies within the global north sometimes, and to an extent the Scandinavian countries that have been supporting us, are also preoccupied with their own problems. And that's perhaps one of the things that the pandemic has shown us. And that is, to what extent can we look the other side? To what extent can we decide that I'm not my brother's keeper anymore because we've got bigger problems? I think that's the challenge that the pandemic has exposed, going forward. But it has also brought some of the best values among us, and that is the sharing among people. Within South Africa itself, we've seen incredible, magnanimous spirit that has emerged within the ordinary people themselves, using their own structures to support each other, but also within the corporate world. People coming, to the fold and deciding that we are going to contribute resources to help the people during this particular time. Isabel, I want to make one last point in relation to this. And this is in relation, because the streams is also about the environment. And what I've been asking myself, what are the lessons? What lessons can we draw from this pandemic as human beings? And there's already talk that the virus jumped from animals to human beings. I think, and I could be wrong, the science will prove this later, it must force us as human beings to rethink our relationships with other species, with objects, with plants, with animals, the realization that we are culpable, that as human beings, we are responsible for some of the things that are happening to us. I think the danger, of course, is that when confronted with a challenge such as this kind of pandemic, our hierarchy of needs tend to shift, and we could lose focus and forget that unless we think seriously about what to do with the earth, what to do with our relationships with other species on earth, these problems are likely to recur. And I think for me, that is one major lesson that we need to learn as human beings, as a community of people going forward.
Well, indeed, that is such a wonderful answer that I think fits so well with the topic that we want to discuss today. And although what you've been relating is quite worrisome, at least there's some hope in some of your account about cooperation and hopefully learning a lesson, as you just said, to finish. So in order to move on to the specific topic for today, I know that you have worked and published extensively on this concept of Ubuntu, which seems to be particularly relevant in these times of global pandemics, as it relates to these notions of community, of well-being. Nevertheless, some also regard Ubuntu as a kind of buzzword because it has become quite popular and has gained currency in public discourses in South Africa. So could you explain the concept to us and how you use it in your research?
Look, Isabel, two things. Let me start by saying that I consider myself, not so much as an Ubuntu scholar. I avoid into this because I had been asked by our Vice Chancellor to lead a project on Ubuntu. That was about around about 2014. And the Templeton World Charity Foundation had given the Archbishop Emeritus, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who championed the concept of Ubuntu during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. They had given him an award for his spiritual work. And they wanted South African University to try and deepen and extend our understanding of Ubuntu as a concept. And of course, part of their reasoning was precisely what you're talking about, that Ubuntu had become a buzzword. And I personally was slightly reluctant to move into this area, precisely because I thought I was going to be caught in a fairly difficult intellectual domain. I'm not a philosopher, neither am I a theologian. I'm a literary scholar by training. But what I've realized is that whenever words enter the public domain, they tend to become buzzwords. And we know of many, you know, whether you're talking of terms such as globalization. For a long time, globalization, you know, had become a buzzword. People wanted to use it to explain all and everything. You know, around in my country here in South Africa, the word narrative has become another buzzword, you know. And for a literary scholar that understands, you know, narrative as the first, you know, cognitive tool ever given to humanities, you know, sometimes when it is being abused, you get worried. You know of the word curate. Everybody drops the word curate every now and again if you want to sound, you know, postmodern and intellectually, you know, astute. So Ubuntu is no exception. The truth of the matter is that Ubuntu was mobilized by politicians as part of a nationalist, you know, a national engagement with a society that was coming from a very difficult history, a society that was divided, a society that was groping for a grammar, for a language to frame its future, to understand the legacy of the past, a society that was trying to say, how do we bring hitherto divided communities, racial, ethnically, class, how do we bring this kind of community together? What language and where do we find that language? And it is in that context that a number of our leaders went back to what I call subjugated sites of knowledge. Subjugated sites of knowledge among marginalized communities, the majority of our people. Where do we find a lexicon that would allow us to build, to reconstitute our community, to reimagine our nation once again? And I think this is how the Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who was leading the commission, which was charged with restorative justice, which was charged with reconciliation, which was charged with redress and trying to ensure that the society moves forward, decided that Ubuntu was really the concept that would help us to bridge some of these gaps. Incidentally, Bishop Tutu even went as far as trying to bring, and I'll be explaining to you what Ubuntu means to me, but Bishop Tutu went out of his way to try and see if there are any striking similarities between Ubuntu and the Christian philosophy. He's a Christian, and therefore he tried as much as possible to see the link between Ubuntu as a concept, a human concept about our humanness, to what he calls Dei Imago theology. Dei Imago theology, put simply, is that we are all made in the image of God. And if we are made in the image of God, then there must be something that binds us together as a community, as a people, regardless of our race, regardless of our background, regardless of, our legacies. There's something that can bring us together. So Ubuntu, simply put, is a Nguni word, which basically means I am because you are. We are because you are. So it is premised on the idea that the full development of personhood comes with shared identity. The idea that an individual's humanity is fostered in a network of relationships. And as you have said in your intro, Ubuntu is a relational idea of personhood. It is about the sociality of human beings. In other words, there's a sense in which it articulates the pre-metaphysical social genesis of the individual and his or her dependence on others for self-actualization. Okay? As the philosopher Masolo says, and I quote, we become persons through acquiring and participating in the socially generated knowledge norms and actions that we learn to live with, to live by, in order to impose humanness upon our humanness. That's Masolo's, telling us. So that, and we need to be clear about this, Isabel, that agency, therefore, does not just reside in individualistic, self-determining, autonomous bodies as we know it in the West. But more importantly, agency also resides in a relationally constituted social persons. I think that's a very important, point, a very important distinction, because normally one of the arguments that is often made is that the moment you talk about a communitarian ethos, shared identity, then you are driving autonomy, you are driving individualism, a self-determining human being underground. And that is, we are trying to argue that, in fact, there's a sense in which self-determination, the principle of agency also resides in a relationally constituted social persons or social beings. So to end, personhood in the sense of Ubuntu is attained through complex processes of exchange and engagement as people interact, communicate with those around them, and with the totality of their environment. That is critical, the totality of their environment. So it's not just about person to person, it is also an engagement with the totality of the environment, which includes the broader human ecology, the broader cosmos, and I hope that we can talk about that in the next segment.
Yeah, thank you for your detailed answer of the concept, which might not be so familiar for people from other cultures outside South Africa and the African continent. And as you just said, I do want us, or would like us, to discuss further this Ubuntu cosmology, because Ubuntu is popularly known as this sociality of human beings, to use your words. But you just finished opening that picture. And I think in the context of this Streams conference, that is particularly relevant. So what about this co-agency? What about this responsibility and relationality with the rest of the environment? And is there any hierarchy there? Are humans responsible for the other elements in this relationship? Is this a horizontal relationship there? How does it work from your experience?
A very important question, Isabel, and by no means very easy. I don't want to pretend, that I have all the answers, but I'll try. I think one of the things that we need to understand is that Ubuntu rests on the principle of co-agency. And co-agency places emphasis on the dialectical relationship between humans and other species. That's very important. In fact, the pre-metaphysical, or rather the pre-colonial metaphysical understanding of most of nature, of human beings in relation to nature in Africa has always been about, co-creation, co-agency, coexistence. And Ubuntu rests on that. So that the relationship between Ubuntu, as I said, between people is not just, between person to person, human beings to human beings. It is also a relationship that brings together other species, whether we're talking of plants, whether we're talking of rivers, in a number of African societies. And I've discovered it's not just in African societies, even in other societies, whether in Asia, South America, you will find this interdependence and reverence for other species. I was being told by a friend, an environmentalist, Juan Carlos, who has done a lot of work in the Amazon. And he was showing us a documentary in which he shows that amongst the Amazonians, if you are fishing and you thought you had caught too much, you threw back some to the river. And the rivers were revered and respected precisely because the livelihood of people were intertwined with those rivers. I come from a lake region, and I know that we have a very strong affinity to the lake, to the point that you even had rituals for the lake. And rituals are really forms of cognition, processes through which human beings seek to reconcile themselves with the world around them, with nature, in a whole range of ways. So that relationship is fairly important. African societies, this kind of relationship also includes reverence to ancestors and supreme beings. Now, I want to emphasize that in pre-colonial metaphysics of nature, the emphasis was always on achieving balance. The word balance is critical between all these elements: human beings, the ecology, ancestors seen as protectors or intermediaries between people and their gods. There was always that attempt to realize, to achieve a balance, striving for harmony and a productive. The emphasis is on the word productive, a productive coexistence between species. So whenever this balance was disrupted or upset, there was always a form of restitution, an attempt to reconcile back to their environment, as I said, either through ritual or sacrifice, or even penalty, if there's a feeling that you have created an imbalance within society. Now, human beings have mistakenly, over the years, they have replaced their responsibility over the earth as co-creators and have instead sought to impose their authority over all species and objects on earth. It is this artificial hierarchy that needs to be disrupted. But Ubuntu too, it would be wrong for me to suggest that there's no sense of hierarchy within Ubuntu, to the extent that most of our African societies, or most societies, are social constructs, and values that emerge out of them are also socially constructed. You will find that socially constructed societies are in many ways structured around patriarchy, around class, around gender bias. So it is not difficult to find that values that come out of these societies will be inflected or affected by some of these social structures. During our research on Ubuntu, one of the silences that we picked up was the silence around the place of women in relation to the creation of this balance, the creation of this harmony, that invariably most rituals of the everyday practices were often led by men. But that's a bias that has a lot to do more with the society. So Ubuntu itself has to be interrogated, is often sometimes mediated by a whole range of factors. And one has to accept that. And that's one of the things that we learned, that although the ideal expression of Ubuntu must entail a recognition of the moral equality of all people, even as an aspirational norm, there are still gaps. There's still, what one would call areas of discrimination that need to be confronted. But that said, I want to suggest that what the values of Ubuntu do is to provide us with grounds for a moral critique of social and other forms of exclusion. But in that sense, it becomes a very powerful tool, that it offers a moral critique of these forms of exclusion. And it does not matter whether these forms of exclusion or discrimination are gender-based, race, or class. That is why Mandela and Archbishop Tutu were able to mobilize it, because it had that capacity in terms of its moral requirement, that it imposes what the Ghanaian philosopher Wiredu calls sympathetic impartiality. It demands of us to exercise some kind of sympathetic impartiality amongst people in our relationships. And that is regardless of race. So I want to link that, Isabel, if you will, to the idea of extractivism, the exploitation of world resources, that as an ethical principle, Ubuntu would be against the kind of extractivism, the exploitation of world resources at the expense of the world's integrity, at the expense of environmental well-being, the survival of creatures, and the totality of our ecological system. So every time the underbelly of extractivism surfaces, we realize that we are hurting other human beings. And this happens all over in Africa. There's been so much said about the Niger Delta in Nigeria. Those of you who know the campaign of, the political activist and writer Ken Saro-Wiwa, it was really about, the destruction of the earth by the British oil companies, BP. As I speak now, there's a case, the Nigerian judiciary system dismissed a case that was brought by local people to protect the environment. And they have had to take this case to Britain on appeal. Hopefully, a form of social justice will be served. In my own backyard in South Africa, the history of mining has left a sorry story. It has built Johannesburg and other places, the South African economy, but it has also had huge human impact. I always joke that silicosis is a form of Anthropocene that is embedded in the lungs of some of these communities. And that is as a result of extraction, the kind of extraction that takes place without any interest on the impact on the ecology, on human beings. So I'm trying to suggest that these challenges that I'm talking about, that come as a result of extraction, of human exploitation of resources, they demand epistemological agility that Ubuntu offers. I'll stop there.
Thank you. That is a very comprehensive answer to the question. And I was indeed interested in all this politics of extractivism, in notions of justice, which you have touched upon when you talked about balance, when you talked about forms of social and other type of exclusion. Also is just letting me know that he will open the floor for the questions that have already been raised at 1:45. But before we move on to the questions, maybe we can, or you can give us your perspective on how can this Ubuntu philosophy be applied and even most importantly, popularized in other cultures? Because before you already mentioned how Western societies are quite often based on, and of course this is a very generalization, a broad generalization, but still often the case that people in the West base their values on notions of individualism, or maybe they are predominantly secular. And as you said, Ubuntu also has a theological dimension. So how do you think this can be applied in such Western or such contexts, whether in the West or otherwise?
Yeah, an important question that always keeps coming up whenever we talk about Ubuntu. Let me start, Isabel, by saying that Ubuntu is not a political program, even though it engages with everyday politics, okay? At the same time, Ubuntu is a value system. It's not about, it does not presuppose a theocratic state, for that matter, you know. A number of African societies obviously never drew, you know, clear lines between, you know, your spiritual domain and the material domain within society. But that's not just in African societies. You know, anybody who reads, you know, ancient, you know, Greek history, or even as recent as in Britain, you know, we know, for example, the king or queen was always also, it was the head of state, but also the spiritual leader, and often led, you know, often, you know, was seen as, you know, head of the Anglican Church. I grew up as a son of an Anglican mother, so I know very well that, our Anglican church was basically called a province, and we were a province of the British church, as it was. So there was that extension. So my point, though, is that Ubuntu, let's be clear, is not a political program. It offers Hello?
Hey.
Have we just lost Professor Ogude?
Hello? Are we back?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
It seems like the connection failed.
Yeah. Is it okay now? Can I continue?
Yes, please do.
Yes. Isabel, let me frame my response to you this way by saying that even within Western societies, which is largely driven by the principle of individualism, there is the principle of basic or minimum human rights as a standard for how everyone ought to be treated. And it is a highly cherished and privileged, principle. The West, too, accepts that judgment will come into what counts as minimum principles of human rights and proper conduct within a community of people. So there's a sense in which the principles of Ubuntu are in certain ways overlaps, even if partially, with certain tenets, certain tendencies within the Western society. I don't know whether you know that within the UN, we have a principle called R2P, that is responsibility to protect. Responsibility to protect, simply put, implies that we have a responsibility as keepers to our brothers, keep vulnerable, that, we cannot see genocide taking place and we keep off. We cannot see human beings dying and we keep quiet about it. We cannot see immigrants moving into our spaces and we turn a blind eye. And that's why I'm trying to suggest that Ubuntu is offering us new ways of reimagining the future. A grammar for promoting the principles of mutuality, peaceful coexistence. It is an outward-looking principle, but also not an inward-looking principle. So that when we talk about restorative justice, when we talk about environmental and social justice, which most Western societies believe in, we are in a way Hello?
Hello.
Oh, I'm afraid it just cut down again when you were about to conclude its end.
Yes, I was basically saying that, there's a way in which some of the values that, some of the things that are embedded in the Ubuntu value system, whether we are talking about restorative justice, environmental and social justice, all these things are shared by humanity, so that Ubuntu is not about the tyranny of community, of collective. It's not a collective tyranny. Most African societies that premised their principles of governance on Ubuntu always worked through what we call consensus building. Mm-hmm. So that people debated, just like in the old Greek democracy, people debated, and at the end of the day, you arrive at a consensus. And once a consensus has been arrived at, then it's binding on all people. That does not mean that there are no dissenting voices. So that's what Ubuntu is all about. Thus, I think it's important for us that in dealing with some of the challenges that confront us, the unbridled individualism that privileges self-interest at the expense of common good or communitarian values, as we have seen with the neoliberalism, for example, in the age of globalization, cannot be the answer. We need to look for answers elsewhere. How do we grapple with the challenges that are facing the society at the moment, whether you're talking about the Black Lives Matter, which is embedded in a history of racism, whether we are talking about the post-pandemic COVID-19 pandemic, which has divided humanity so much. I think we are groping for a language. And I'm trying to suggest that there's a sense in which Ubuntu questions, challenges the social inequality and the existential inequality, including epistemic injustice, which basically means that for humanity to find its answers, we must also look at post-colonial societies or those marginalized societies for some of these answers. They may not answer everything, but they do offer certain possibilities for the future.
Well, I think that is a very good message to end with, and food for thought, right? For all of us who are concerned about all these issues that you have just raised in your answers. And maybe now, if Otso agrees, then he could open the floor. Jens has been hosting.
Yes, thank you so much for the conversation so far. And I had actually compiled like a combined question of the questions that came in, and I have to say that your last answer was was a very good answer to those questions in many ways. But there's been a lot of interest towards the relative and the universal, and how to, whether Ubuntu is a specifically South African concept, or and you kind of answered that question already, but also in what ways it could be disseminated and applied in new context. And I feel that you also actually addressed that question already. There was one question related to that notion of universal or the particular, about talking about injustice and justice. So whose justice are we talking about, and who is the judge in an international world? Or even if you talk about interspecies, multispecies injustice, where should the responsibility lie, if you see what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Okay, let me just go back briefly to the concept of Ubuntu. One of the things that we discovered during our research, that Ubuntu has a lot of striking similarities across the continent of Africa, especially among the so-called Bantu-speaking groups. In East Africa, it is called Utu. And it's basically the same thing, you know. Utu is also a Swahili word, you know, for this relational idea of personhood. So there's a sense in which Ubuntu shares this. During our research, we also discovered that there are a lot of similar examples in South America and certain parts of Asia that basically have striking similarities between what we see as Ubuntu values and some of the values, you know, that reside in certain, sections of their, traditional communities. So Ubuntu really, people would like to think that is basically a South African thing, but if you look at etymological roots, then you suddenly discover that its etymology extends far and beyond, South Africa. And that's why we do have the principle of Utu within East Africa. In fact, Mwalimu Julius Nyerere, the late former president of Tanzania, came up with a word called Ujamaa. Ujamaa was basically, the principle of sharing and living together, which speaks to versatility and the way that this concept travels across historical spaces, across geographical spaces, and also across, many other divides. Justice. Look, I think when we talk about, justice, we are always concerned about issues of scale and culpability in the first instance. In other words, and I want to talk here specifically about justice in relation to, the Anthropocene or the degradation of our world. And the truth of the matter is that the issue, of scale, when we talk about responsibility to the destruction of the earth, is not similar. It is common knowledge that the most vulnerable communities in terms of the impact of climate change are Africa and Asia. And yet we are the least culpable. We are the least, group responsible. So if you're looking for justice, then in some ways, people have to accept responsibility for what is happening to the earth and understand that the Anthropocene is not undifferentiated.
Mm-hmm.
It takes place in different ways. Neither are we affected in the same way. So my idea of the principle of justice is really embedded in the inequality. I've talked about epistemic inequality, but we can also talk about economic and social inequalities, whether it is, South, North, global South and global, but even within African societies themselves, the responsibility for the destruction of the climate is not equally shared. We know, for example, that the consumerist ideology, the consumerist tendencies is predominantly amongst the African elite, They are the ones that pollute our earth more than your ordinary people. So it's these issues of scale, it's these issues of, variations in terms of justice that one is talking about. And of course, in respect to, to human ecology. I'm not sure whether I've answered whoever raised that question, but those are my thoughts.
Yes,
if
that's
I
perfect.
may pitch in here, because time is running out, and I've been having a look through the questions, and there's so many interesting questions still waiting for an answer, and we have like 2 minutes left. There's some people are talking about whether we should talk about one Anthropocene or specific Anthropocenes, which I think is something to reflect upon. There's also the fact of whether Anthropocene is the right term, something that is quite often discussed, because as you, James, just said, anthropos means all of humanity, and not all humans are equally responsible for the situation right now. Marco Armiero also wonders whether we can rely on official justice when sometimes the judicial system actually allows for injustices to take place. As you were just saying with the example in Nigeria, I think it was that they have to move this to another court to see if the appeal will work there, because not official justice sometimes does not work or give the answer citizens might expect and think as fair. So all of these are pending questions that I think are just something like food for thought. And of course, if we could just continue this discussion, we could be here for a long time. But I don't know what Otso says, but maybe we just need to to close down. What do you think, Otso?
Yeah, unfortunately, that's my role here to to close the discussion. It's been
Yeah.
really, really good, and thank you, Isabel, for being a fantastic host and fantastic timekeeping as well, and thank you, Professor Ogude, for a very interesting talk. Thank you for listening, and this will be online as you probably know at this point by later today, the whole talk at meetstreams.com. Thank you so much. Have a short break, and then we see you again in 5 minutes.
Thank you, Isabel. Thank you, Otto.
Bye bye. Thank you.